edition of that. And today we present you Lord Minimus, The Extraordinary Life of Britain's Smallest Man by Nick Page. We'll delve into about a half hour's worth of this book. Omega Book Center, Peachtree City, Georgia. There he is. Lord Minimus, Jeffrey Hudson, Folclair. What's he say? Soroth? Groth? Todd R. Groth. Nice stamp. I should get one of those too. The story of the pie. In 1626, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, hosted a royal banquet. The guests of honor were King Charles I and his new young wife, Henrietta Maria. The Duke had a special, indeed unique gift, a veritable rarity of nature for the Queen, and it was to be delivered to Henrietta Maria in a manner which she would never forget. Buckingham was, if nothing else, a showman. His evenings usually featured a show on an entertainment, but that night he had planned something different. As the feast reached its climax, the trumpets blared, and the crowded hall fell silent. Two footmen entered, carrying between them a platter of which stood a large pie. It was a fine example of the master cook's art, some 2 feet long and a foot high, its pastry gilded with gold leaf and glistening in the candlelight. They carried it with great solemnity through the crowded banqueting hall, past tables groaning under the weight of salmon and stewed carp, venison, capons, and whole geese, right to where the guests of honor were seated on a raised dais, or is it dais? With great ceremony, the pie was set down in front of the young queen. The Duke turned to Henrietta Maria, bowed low, and handed her a knife. She must have been puzzled. It was a pie, a little large, to be sure, and extravagantly decorated, but nothing out of the ordinary, and certainly not the gourmet fare that was already before her. And was he really inviting her to cut it? Was this presumptuous man really asking the Queen of England to serve herself? Mystified, she went along with the game. She took the knife and rose, preparing to cut into the pie. It was just as she was about to cut into the crust that she noticed the pie was moving. The crust was rising, being lifted from within. A hand appeared, a tiny hand smaller than a child's, more like that of a baby. Two eyes peeped out, then a face, tinier than any doll's and framed by a miniature helmet. Finally, before the entranced queen's gaze, the crust was thrown back and a tiny figure emerged. It was a boy, the smallest human being that anyone had ever seen, perfectly proportioned and dressed in a suit of miniature armor. He climbed out of the pie and stood shyly on the table in front of the queen. Then, as if remembering the script, he started to march up and down and wave his flag, weaving around the gold plates, the ornate salt cellar, and the fine Venetian glassware, acknowledging the rapturous applause of the court. Then, as the applause died away, he stood in front of the queen and bowed low. The queen gazed at the little boy adoringly, only 15, alone in a foreign country and trapped in an apparently loveless marriage. She surrounded herself with pets, monkeys, dogs, and birds in cages. Now here was the ultimate present, a little man to call her own. The Duke smiled graciously. Everything had worked flawlessly, the perfect present delivered in the perfect manner. The young queen laughed and clapped in delight. The crowd cheered. The little boy looked around him in wonder. His name was Jeffrey Hudson. He was 7 years old and only 18 inches high, and his life is one of the most remarkable stories of the 17th century. Oh, Lord. The receipt. The receipt. All we have is a receipt. It is not much in terms of historical documents, just a receipt signed Geoffrey Hudson, acknowledging a gift of £5. But for me, when I unearthed it on a spring day in the public record office in London, it was like the Holy Grail. For here at last was something from his own hands. Here was something that he had touched, that he had written himself, a receipt for £5, signed in a shaking, tremulous hand. Here at last was a personal memento of Geoffrey Hudson, the Queen's dwarf, the hero of the pie, the smallest man in England, and one of the most remarkable characters of the 17th century. He is written about by others. He appears in paintings, poems, and plays. His actions are reported in official dispatches, even in the very early newspapers. But from his own hand, we have nothing. Nothing, that is, except the receipt for £5 signed when he was tired and old and forgotten. Strange as it may seem, looking at that signature in the cold spring light brought it home to me. This was a man. He had actually lived, and his story was true. This is the tale of the tiniest man in England. It will take us from the heart of the English countryside to the edges of the known world, from the lowest social stratum to the seats of kings and princes. It is a tale of pirates and princes, playwrights and poets, of soldiers and countries, or courtiers, of shipwreck, slavery, and imprisonment. It is a remarkable life, given that Geoffrey was largely a peripheral figure. He was not a great statesman, not an orator or an artist. He spent much of his life standing in the corner, observing. Yet the times he lived through and the events on which he looked were some of the most significant in history. The wars and the adventures, the triumphs and the tragedies of the 17th century had profound consequence, not just for England, but for Europe and the world. And through all this, Geoffrey was there. He was the friend of queens and kings. His life was lived both in palaces and prisons. He was a courtier, slave, soldier, and criminal. He was painted by great artists and celebrated in verse by court poets. He made people laugh and cry. He was one of the wonders of his age. What are all these little faces? What is it, bruv? Well, over time, his story has become distorted. Fiction has been taken for fact. It is not surprising that this is so, for from his first appearance, Geoffrey the dwarf was always seen as a miraculous, almost fictional creature. What is perhaps more surprising is that his life was so bizarre that any fictional add-ons are simply not necessary. There are two main contemporary accounts of Geoffrey's life. The earliest is in Thomas Fuller's The Worthies of England, published in 1662. Allow me to shift here. The account is incomplete and lacks certain details. Fuller does not know Geoffrey's surname, for example, but as will be shown, it is substantially correct. The second account is by James. His histories and antiquities of the county of Rutland, published in 1684 after Geoffrey's death. Wright's history is unique because he actually knew and spoke to Geoffrey. These are the only two contemporary narratives, and together they do not add up to more than a few hundred words. The rest of Geoffrey's story must be drawn from other sources: diaries, letters, diplomatic reports, poems, plays, even early newspapers. And of course, receipts. There are, however, two more accounts of Geoffrey's life, both of which are more remarkable for the effect that they had on some than for the accuracy of their portrayal. The first of these was written by Henry Stonecastle of Northumberland, owner and publisher and chief contributor to the Universal Spectator and Weekly Journal. Stonecastle claims that his biography has the benefit of some short hand notes. My computer's not computer, but my phone. There we go. Come on. It's got this damn notification if I don't hold it exactly the way they want me to. There we go. Claims that his biography has the benefit of some shorthand notes, which were taken of this diminutive hero by a curious micrographer, and FRS fellow of the Royal Society of the last century. However, Stonecastle does not give the name of his source, and the shorthand pun undermines the seriousness of his work. However, while Stonecastle's narrative reads as if it was written with a smirk, it does show signs of some original research. He gives us some plausible details of John Hudson's role at Burleigh and some insight into the character of Geoffrey's parents. The problem is winnowing out those real events from what appear to be apocryphal anecdotes, and plain myths. Sorry, I had an itch. The second account is by Sir Walter Scott, the novelist. In 1822, he published Peveril of the Peak, a historical novel set in the time of Charles II. Geoffrey appears as Sir Geoffrey Hudson and tells the hero, young Julian Peveril, details of his life story. We need not go into those details here, but what is remarkable is the way in which Scott's account, his invented words and imagined history, became accepted fact. By 1910, a Rutland historian was able to state with certainty, for example, that Geoffrey fought alongside Prince Rupert at the Battle of Newbury, and even what he said to the troops there. Neither of these facts is historically verifiable. Both were invented by Walter Scott. To Scott, as well, we owe the often used title of Sir Geoffrey Hudson. Geoffrey was never knighted. He was certainly a captain of horse, and proudly used the title in later life, but he was never Sir Geoffrey Hudson. For over 300 years, writers have added incredible events and unbelievable details to Geoffrey's life story. But the truly amazing thing about Geoffrey is that his life needed no embellishing. It was fantastic enough already. One of the first issues I had to face in telling this story was one of terminology. To many people, the term dwarf is seen as offensive, a label reflecting the discrimination and prejudice. There was no "the" in there. While I appreciate their feelings, I feel that alternatives such as little person or person of limited stature would be both unwieldy and unhelpful. Geoffrey was throughout his life referred to as a dwarf, and that is the description I have used in this book. He certainly experienced and fought prejudice and ignorance, but he was the Queen's dwarf, and this was the common term used in his day. I faced similar difficulties when trying to decide how to spell his name. In 17th century England, spelling was not an exact science, especially when it came to names. Most people could neither read nor write, and even those who could were entirely at the mercy of clerks and officials who would simply put down the name as they thought it should be spelled. Geoffrey's mother, for example, was written down as Luce, the clerk's spelling of the name Lucy. Geoffrey seems to have had many variants. He appears in records as Geoffrey, 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 and Geoffrey. In France, he was referred to as Geoffroy. The record of his baptism in the parish register spells his name Geoffrey, and in his only signature he signed himself Geoffrey. In the accounts of his life, he has generally been called Geoffrey Hudson, and that is the convention I have used throughout this book. Similarly, I have altered the dating system. In the 17th century, Britain was still using the Julian calendar, in which the new year began on 25 March. That means that a date which they called, say, February 1626, we would call February 1627. Historians usually use the convention February 16, 26, 27, but for simplicity's sake, I have taken January as the beginning of the year. Finally, with regards to sums of money and relative values, any attempt to translate these into modern equivalents is fraught with difficulties because of the large number of variables involved. It is not a matter of simple multiplying the sum by a certain amount. The prices of commodities such as grain, clothing, meat, land, and property have all fluctuated greatly in the past 400 years. The laws of supply and demand, combined with advances in technology and agriculture, mean that certain items now cost less in real terms than they did in the 17th century. Buying patterns have changed. In Geoffrey's day, oysters were a common food and lemons a rarity. Likewise, we now have entirely different standards of living from those of our predecessors. A farm laborer of the present day lives in a manner that his 17th century equivalent would regard as positively palatial. Nevertheless, some indication of the relative value of the sums mentioned in this book can be obtained by bearing in mind that between 30 and 45 pounds per year constituted a very substantial wage. Certainly, a gentleman with an income of 45 pounds had no need to work for a living, while a farm laborer earning between 5 and 10 pounds a year would have found it hard to support his family. There are still many gaps to fill in Geoffrey's story. So much is still supposition of assumption. So much has to be deduced from scraps and fragments. At times, therefore, my quest has been less like biography and more like archaeology, like the piecing together of shattered fragments, the unearthing of a lost portrait. We know the facts of Geoffrey's life, but without any personal reminiscences, without any letters or diaries, we cannot tell what he was thinking or feeling. In such cases, interpretation and supposition are inevitable, but not, I trust, irresponsible in all cases. I hope the suppositions and interpretations are based on facts and contemporary accounts. I have avoided filling the pages with detailed notes and references, but the general sources at the back of the book will tell the reader more about where I have found the information. In the end, all we have from his own hand is a receipt, signed in his later years, when the glory of life at court had been overtaken by decades of poverty, imprisonment, and neglect. Not much, but when you understand that piece of paper, when you know what he went through before he came to put his signature to the document, then that simple receipt becomes more significant. Far from being a throwaway scrap, it becomes a mute testimony to one man's courage and perseverance, to his determination to overcome his physical limitations and live life to the full. Geoffrey Holland was a remarkable man, and his story deserves to be told. Yes, it does. And we will stop there because I'm not going to be able to read a full chapter in 10 minutes. I've always had an eye on reading this book and never have, but now I'm teaming on that exploration. Geoffrey Hudson was a life of splendor and riches, of piracy and slavery. All right, that's all. That's the introduction to Lord Minimus, The Extraordinary Life of Britain's Smallest Man, by Nick Page, which reminds me of Nick Pope, the UFO researcher. All right, Bob. There we go. I usually go 30 minutes, but as I said, it's fruitless today unless someone pipes in and quickly and tells me to proceed. But I should love buddy. I wonder how tall he got. He was only 18 inches at 7 years old.